At night, the Carrington Systems building looked like a massive spaceship hovering in the heart of Manhattan. Everything was silent, cold, precise, from the sharp white lights spilling onto the polished stone floors to the low hum of the air conditioning behind soundproof walls. A place designed for busy people to exist without ever having to touch each other. And in the familiar darkness of the 26th floor, where support departments only lit up during the day, a woman quietly pushed a janitorial cart down the hallway. Amara Sloan, 32 years old, widowed, single mother. And at this hour every night, she was the only person doing the kind of work the world conveniently forgets, keeping this place clean so no one else had to think about who did it. Amara didn't stand out. She was tall and slender, with pale skin from too many sleepless nights, her brown hair pulled into a quick bun at the nape of her neck. Her gray uniform had faded from countless machine washes, and her cheap sneakers absorbed the sound of every step. But one thing about her always stood out: the folded piece of blue fabric tucked neatly onto the left side of her chest. That cloth wasn't part of the official uniform, but no one ever asked, and she never explained. In truth, it was a remnant of her husband's scarf, a firefighter who never came home from the warehouse fire at the docks 2 years ago. At the time, she was 7 months pregnant. Ever since, she had kept a piece of that scarf close to her heart every day, as if it were proof that she still had a reason to keep going. Amara's presence at Carrington was like a hallway light. Everyone expected it to work, but no one noticed when it lit up. She didn't talk much, didn't greet people unless necessary, but her eyes missed nothing from the tiniest smudge on a desk to the fresh footprints on the carpet. She knew there was a burn mark in the corner of the large conference room from someone plugging in the kettle with the wrong voltage. She knew the employee at desk 14 always left crumpled tissues under the chair, and the coffee machine on the 26th floor leaked a little water from its tray at precisely 3 a.m. every night. She didn't memorize these things out of curiosity, but out of habit, surviving by noticing. And though this job was at night, her days were anything but restful. Amara's morning shift started at 4:30 a.m. She'd wake up, make a bottle of milk, prepare a sandwich, and then gently wake up Zion, her son, to take him to the community center 3 blocks from their apartment. The center catered to mothers working double shifts and had a small class for deaf children, staffed by someone fluent in ASL. To Amara, that was more of a luxury than health insurance. Zion was born without hearing. He came into the world in silence, and since then, the world had stayed silent for him. But his eyes were always bright. The way he smiled when Amara signed, "Mom loves you," or waved back with the sign for, "Wait for me to come home," each time she turned to leave the center, made Amara feel like her hands could speak. She learned ASL like a drowning person learning to swim with no other choice. As a child, she had once dreamed of being a preschool teacher. But life doesn't ask what your dreams are. It just hands you the bills. Amara worked 2 jobs every day with a single short nap in between. The one thing she never forgot was the piece of blue cloth. That cloth wasn't just a memory, it was a reminder. Survive. Tonight was no different. She moved from zone to zone, checking each print room, scrubbing every sink, doing the work no one ever wondered about. She nodded at Tony, the night security guard, the only person at Carrington who called her by name. "Evening, blue cloth girl," he said through the glass. "Hey, Mr. Tony, no tea tonight?" "Still got 1 peppermint bag left in the drawer under the desk. Might brew it when you get up to 39. She smiled. They always exchanged words like that, not too much, not too little, just enough to remind each other they were still here. Amara continued down the hallway toward the large conference room. The frosted glass door was slightly ajar. The white light inside was still on. She frowned. At this hour, every office zone was supposed to be empty. According to the schedule, no one had booked the room past midnight. She stepped closer, intending to check if someone had just forgotten to turn off the lights. You're watching Soul Stories, where every story whispers of love, healing, and hope. Let us know which city you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and be a part of our journey. Now stay with us. The story is just beginning. Amara stepped into the conference room on the 39th floor with slight hesitation. The room was spacious, with dark wooden floors, glass walls on 3 sides, and a meeting table as long as the horizon. Every night it was usually empty chairs neatly arranged, lights off on schedule. But tonight the lights were still on, quiet, as if the room itself was keeping a secret. She pushed the cleaning cart to the doorway and stopped. Elliot Carrington was sitting alone at the head of the table. No secretary, no assistant, no laptop, no paperwork. Just him, fingers interlocked on the table, eyes staring into the endless cityscape beyond the glass. Behind him, the city still glowed traffic flowing like the lifeblood of a massive organism. But he looked like stone. Something was off. Amar had seen him before in videos, in framed pictures, always as a symbol of power, confidence, a man who knew exactly where he was headed. But now his gaze was hollow, as if every sound had just been drained from the air around him. She stayed still, trying not to make a noise. But Elliot turned his head. He looked at her. His lips moved, maybe a question, maybe a greeting, but no sound reached her, and there was no clear expression on his face, only a sort of disorientation, like he wasn't sure if he was dreaming or awake. Amara took a step forward and said softly, "I can come back later if you need privacy." Elliot kept looking at her. No reaction, no frown, no nod, just emptiness. Then slowly, he raised his hand. A shaky motion. He drew a small arc in the air and pointed to his ear. A chill ran down Amara's spine. She knew that sign. It was ASL. Clumsy but unmistakable. "I can't hear." She walked closer, unhurried. Her hands relaxed at her sides. Elliot watched her like he was trying to figure out if he had really managed to send a thought out into the world. She raised her hand slowly. Her fingers moved gently. "I understand. I know sign language. Are you okay?" This time Elliot blinked. A small movement, but so human. He replied with his hands, not fluent, not smooth, but trying. Accident. Impact. 2 days ago. Hearing loss. Doctor said, temporary. The signs were choppy, but clear enough to Amara. She didn't ask more. Didn't need details. What she saw wasn't a medical condition. It was a man used to commanding the world, now forced to live in one he couldn't control. Elliot signed again, hesitantly. "No one knows, can't work. Everything too quiet." Amara nodded gently. Then she signed, calm and warm. "I have a son, 6 years old, deaf. I used to be terrified, but I learned how to listen with my eyes. Would you like me to stay a little while?" Elliot tilted his head slightly, as if no one had ever offered him something so simple. He signed, "I just need someone who understands." So they sat down separated by a wide table. A man who had just lost his hearing, and a woman who had survived in a world that never really listened to her. In that space, there were no voices, no reports, no urgent emails, only hands moving, each gesture lit by patience and shared humanity. Elliot signed about how losing his hearing felt like being ripped out of the world without warning. Every meeting became chaos. Every glance at him seemed on the verge of discovering a weakness. He signed, "I used to control rooms with my voice. Now I hear nothing, and they don't hear me anymore." Amara responded, "It's not because you're silent, it's because they never truly listened." He raised his eyebrows slightly. She smiled. "Sometimes losing your voice is the only way people start to really see you." Elliot rested his hands on the table. For the first time, his eyes showed something like relief. She asked gently with her hands, "Does anyone else know?" He shook his head. "Number only the doctor. I'm not ready." Then he paused. His hands trembled slightly. "They'll think I'm weak." Amara looked at him for a long time. Then she signed, "My son isn't weak. He just doesn't hear with his ears. And you, I think you're learning something everyone should have known from the start. No one is invincible." Elliot turned to the glass wall. The city still moved, but inside that room, time seemed to slow. He signed slowly like a confession. "I used to think silence meant failure." She replied, "Number silence is when no one stays with you in it. But I'm here." For the first time, Elliot Carrington smiled. Not big, not clear, but real. No theatrics, no HR protocols, just a man who had found someone in the middle of the night, and that someone didn't walk away. When Amara stood to return to her duties, Elliot didn't try to stop her. But when she gave a small nod and signed, "See you again," he raised his hand and signed back, "Please don't tell anyone. But thank you." Amara nodded. She stepped out, returned to her cart, and picked up her cleaning cloth. The blue cloth was still pinned to her chest. This time it seemed a little brighter, as if it had just helped carry the most important sound in a person's life: understanding. Amara had just stepped into the locker room when she heard a soft knock at the door. It didn't sound like her supervisor, nor the security guard. She turned around. A man in a black suit, wearing a discreet earpiece in his right ear, stood waiting just outside. "Amara Sloan?" he asked, voice calm and low. She nodded instinctively. "Mr. Carrington would like to see you, right now." Her heart skipped a beat. When the private elevator stopped at the top floor, a level her employee badge had never granted her access to, Amara was almost certain she was about to be fired. Maybe for invading a private space. Maybe for overstepping boundaries. Or worse, she'd be accused of seeing something she wasn't supposed to. Even though what happened the night before wasn't her fault, there were too many ways someone like her could be quietly dismissed, with no one ever asking why. When the doors opened, the hallway ahead stretched out in warm walnut wood, glowing under the soft light of early morning. The air carried a faint scent of freshly roasted coffee. The man who escorted her didn't step inside, he just nodded once and stepped back. Amara stood still for a few seconds. Then she took a breath and walked in. The top-floor conference room looked nothing like the ones below. No logos, no monitors, no digital boards. Just a large wooden table, a few simple chairs, and a whiteboard standing near the glass wall, beyond which the city skyline was beginning to stir. And there stood Elliot Carrington holding a dry erase marker, writing something on the board. He turned when he heard the door. Still in a white dress shirt, sleeves rolled up. His expression wasn't blank like it had been the night before, but it wasn't comfortable either. He nodded to her, then gestured to the chair across from him. No one spoke. There was no need. Amara sat down. Elliot wrote a few lines on the whiteboard, then turned it toward her. "Where did you learn that language?" Amara looked at the words. The handwriting was firm, precise, not the writing of someone feeling powerless. She raised her hands and signed gently, "My son, deaf since birth. I learned to understand him." Elliot gave a small nod and wiped the board clean. Another question appeared. "Do you have any degrees?" Amara hesitated. Part of her wanted to simply say no. But another part, deeper, wanted to tell him about the early childhood education degree she had to abandon when she became pregnant with Zion. About the unfinished online courses, the dreams she once folded up and tucked away in a drawer next to baby blankets. She signed simply, "I studied education, but never finished my degree." Elliot watched her for a long moment. Then he turned back to the board. "I need a translator until I can hear again." Amara looked up. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers brushing each other. She didn't respond right away. Not because she didn't understand, but because she wasn't sure this was real. Elliot continued writing. "I don't trust tech. AI translators are slow, lack context. My team doesn't know sign. I can't hold meetings, negotiate, or handle crises without communication." He looked at her, direct, honest, no pretense. "I need you." That sentence took her breath away, not because of the offer, but because of the acknowledgement. She lifted her hands, signing carefully. "I'm just a janitor. I'm not sure I'm qualified." Elliot raised his hand, interrupting in sign. "Not just. Don't erase yourself." In his eyes, for the first time, was the look of someone who had fallen and learned how to climb back up. A long moment passed. Amara turned to the window. The city was beginning to brighten. The sky glowed a soft lavender gray, and the buildings looked freshly drawn in clean light after a long rain. She turned back and signed, "I'll try, but I can't give up my morning shift at the cafe. I need both jobs." Elliot didn't answer right away. Then he erased the board and wrote a shorter line. "I'll pay triple." Amara paused. Part of her reacted immediately for the money, for the necessity, for the child growing up with tuition, hospital visits, and meals that needed to be nutritious. But another part, quieter, felt fear. If she stepped into this world, She would have to shed the invisibility that had kept her safe for so long. She looked at him. Sign slowly, I don't want pity. I just want to work the right way. Elliot signed back. Then work with me. Not because I can't hear, but because you're the only one who looked me in the eye when I had nothing left to command. Amara didn't smile, but the corners of her mouth softened. She nodded. Not for the money, not for a life-changing opportunity, but because, for the first time, in a place filled with the noise of power, she had just heard a genuine offer. When she left the top-floor room, she didn't walk fast or slow, but every step felt heavier, not from fear, but from the weight of something new. Someone was waiting for her to step into a role she had never imagined for herself. Amara's presence on the executive floor was like a wordless soundtrack, unnoticed at first, then slowly weaving into everyone's awareness until they realized they couldn't function without her being there. She didn't sit at the table, didn't speak, didn't take notes, but she stood behind Elliot Carrington, silent, steady, like a living shadow, and she was the only one in the room who understood the full conversation, both spoken and unspoken. Because Elliot still spoke. His voice hadn't changed, deep, clear, composed. He read slides, asked questions, made demands, and occasionally threw in a sarcastic remark that made the room chuckle awkwardly. It's just, he couldn't hear anyone replying. No applause, no objections, no whispers. His world had become one-directional unless Amara raised her hands. She didn't just translate. She listened for him with her eyes, with emotion, with a sensitivity no AI interpreter could replicate. The first meeting with her present began with tension. Elliot sat at the head of the table. Amara stood behind him, quiet as a tech assistant. The executives exchanged glances. Some squinted. One tapped a pen softly on the desk. No one said anything, but no one was at ease. When the presentation began, Elliot nodded, eyes focused ahead. The speaker went on and on, assuming Elliot was listening closely. Only when Elliot tilted his head slightly back and murmured, "What's the CFO's expression?" did Amara step forward and sign briefly. Worried, holding something back. Eyes down when maintenance costs were mentioned. Elliot nodded, smirked faintly, and interrupted the speaker. Seems like you're trying to gloss over last quarter's budget. Anything you want to correct? The room went still. No one understood how he knew. No one asked how the girl behind him knew what he needed. But from that moment on, they began to look at Amara differently. Elliot still spoke as before, but he no longer knew if his voice was too loud or too soft. He couldn't tell who was whispering, who was cutting in. Couldn't feel the emotional temperature of the room, something he once read in an instant. That's where Amara's unique role came alive. She didn't just interpret words, she interpreted the air. When someone spoke anxiously, she wouldn't just sign, "He's talking about costs." She'd add, voice trembling, uncertain. If someone rejected a proposal, she wouldn't just sign, "They disagree." She'd add, "Says no, but clenched hands may be pressure from higher up." Elliot began to trust her. No need to verify, no follow-ups. Because every time he acted based on her insights, the outcome proved she was right. Staff grew curious. Rumors spread quickly through the office floors. Some said she was a sign language consultant from the Department of Defense. Others claimed she once saved the CEO's life in an accident, so he let her stay. Harsher voices whispered, "Probably just some PR move. Once he recovers, she'll disappear." But no one asked her directly, and Elliot has always remained completely silent on the matter. He never introduced her at events, never added her name to company documents, never gave her a title. But every morning before speaking in the conference room, he'd always glance to his right where Amara stood before he began. She didn't see herself as important. She was just filling a gap temporarily. But each day she understood him more. She noticed how Elliot glanced slightly left when he was about to say something sincere. Knew he liked to control the flow of dialogue, but always let the other party have the last word. Knew he sometimes repeated a phrase silently to himself to make sure he didn't say it wrong. And Elliot gradually learned how to hear again through her hands, her eyes, the rhythm of her breathing. They were like two musicians playing the same piece. One look was enough to know what note was coming next. One afternoon, after a meeting about AI investment chains, Elliot turned to Amara as the room emptied. The two of them left alone. "You never interrupt," he said, "but you always speak at the right time." Amara hesitated, then signed gently. "Because I know your world used to be loud." He let out a short, rough laugh. "Yeah, so loud I stopped hearing anything real." Amara nodded. Sometimes silence was the only thing loud enough to make sense. Elliot looked out the window. It was lightly raining. Streaks of water ran down the glass like a language no one could read. He asked, "Do you ever feel like you're wandering through places you don't belong in?" She nodded instantly without thinking. "All the time." "Then how do you stay standing?" This time she replied with her voice, "Because my son is wandering too, and he needs to see that I haven't fallen." Elliot didn't respond, but for the first time, he didn't need to hear with his ears to understand with his heart. At the end of that meeting, Elliot didn't leave the room right away. Instead of rising as usual, he gestured for Amara to stay. No whiteboard, no formal signs, just a lingering glance, like he was debating whether to break a rule, not of the company, but of himself. "I've been thinking about the boy," he said in a low, steady voice. "Your son." Amara nodded. No hands, no signs. Her eyes said yes clearly enough. Elliot leaned back in his chair. "I don't know if I have the right to ask about your personal life, but I think I've forgotten how to start a conversation that isn't about work." Amara smiled softly. She reached into her pocket and unfolded a small piece of paper, a crayon drawing. A curly-haired boy standing between two raised hands, surrounded by ASL symbols. She placed the paper in front of Elliot, then signed, "Zion, 6 years old, born deaf, but he knows how to love music in his own way." Elliot touched the edge of the drawing, gently, as if afraid to smudge the colors. "He's used sign language since he was little?" Amara scribbled a reply on a blank sheet next to the drawing. "I learned first, then taught him. He's much better than I am." Elliot nodded and fell silent for a long time. Then he asked, "Do you ever get tired of always being the one who has to understand first?" Amara looked up. Her eyes rested on his face no longer. The CEO, no longer the symbol of tech dominance, just a man finally daring to touch a truth he'd never named aloud. She signed, "Sometimes, but when my son smiles, I feel enough." Elliot sat quietly. In his gaze, she saw something unspoken, like his whole life was running behind those eyes, and he didn't know how to grab one moment to say out loud. Finally, Amara took out her phone. She said nothing, just opened a video marked with a yellow star, a favorite, and handed it to him. A clip of Zion's performance at the community center. The boy stood on a small stage. No music played, only movement. He moved his hands with imagined rhythm, his feet bouncing to a beat only he could hear. His face shone, as if he were singing with his entire body. No words, no sound. But afterward, the audience clapped loudly and Zion bowed with perfect ceremony. Elliot didn't take his eyes off the screen. When the video ended, he whispered, "I never imagined silence could be that radiant." Amara nodded, saying nothing. He leaned back, exhaled. "When I was a kid, my father made me recite the alphabet every morning before breakfast. If I forgot a letter, he'd tap the table, not hit, just tap right as I stumbled. And I learned I was only allowed to speak correctly. No stopping, no repeating, no asking." His voice was steady. No anger, no pity, just truth. "Later, I became a very good speaker, but I never really learned how to listen." She sat still. He looked toward the window again. "I thought I was in control because I could articulate things, but when my hearing disappeared, I realized I'd never truly understood people." Amara signed slowly. "Not because you couldn't, but because no one ever taught you with love." Elliot looked at her. For the first time, his eyes weren't searching for answers or scanning or calculating. He was simply looking as if someone was finally standing in front of him without asking for anything except that he be there. He asked quietly, "Does Zion know how amazing his mother is?" Amara smiled, shaking her head. "Someday he will, or I'll let him see it for himself." Elliot nodded. "You know," he said, "I never believed in empathy. Thought it was just a buzzword to paint corporate reports with. But right now, I think if anything's real, it's these quiet things. The ones without sound. She didn't reply, just raised her hands and signed. Sometimes the greatest thing we can do is to stay beside someone in their silence. And Elliot nodded. Not because she was right, but because, for the first time, he had felt it in the language of the heart. No translation needed. Still following the story? If this story found you outside of Soul Stories, we invite you home to where every touching tale begins with truth, hope, and heart. Amara entered the conference room as usual, blue cloth pinned to her chest, hair neatly tied in a bun, arms holding a folder of sign language notes prepared for that morning's presentation. No one greeted her, but some eyes today were different, more focused, and not entirely friendly. She wasn't surprised. Since the day she began standing behind Elliot, she knew the moment would come when someone would ask the question. And this morning, the question arrived not through words, but through the presence of Mr. Harris. Richard Harris, one of the three longest-standing members of the board of directors, a man with slicked silver hair, a perfectly knotted tie, and eyes that measured numbers, not people. He hadn't attended a meeting in person in over 6 months, but today he was here arms crossed, staring at Amara as if she'd just tracked dust across a silk carpet. Elliot sat at the head of the table, composed as ever. White shirt, crisp movements, steady voice. He spoke about the restructuring strategy for the engineering division, as if nothing was amiss. Amara stood silently behind him, interpreting the room's reactions with her hands. She watched every furrowed brow, every pursed lip, every tightly gripped coffee cup, and translated them through eyes and fingers. Then it was Harris's turn to speak. He didn't look at Elliot. He looked straight at Amara. "Before I begin," he said, "I have a small concern. Regarding personnel." No one responded. "This young woman," he pointed without hesitation. "Who is she?" There was no evasion in the question, just the bluntness of someone used to eliminating whatever didn't belong in the system. The room fell silent. Some glanced at Elliot. Others looked down. Elliot kept his gaze on the screen, not responding. Harris continued, "She isn't part of any department, has no official position. She's not listed on the executive staff directory. And I certainly haven't signed off on a sign language interpreter role on this floor." Elliot rested his hands on the table. His expression darkened slightly. He looked up but said nothing. "In a global corporation like Carrington," Harris said evenly, voice as precise as a ruler, "everything must be transparent. No one, under any circumstance, should be present in strategic meetings without a title, responsibilities, and a formal agreement. I request that she leave until proper verification is made." Amara heard every word, even though she wasn't looking at him. Her hand tightened slightly at her side. She waited for Elliot to speak. Just one word, just one gesture. A signal, like always, that she wasn't invisible. But Elliot remained still, didn't look at her, didn't look at Harris. The silence was no longer wordless. It was a refusal. Amara lowered her head. No one gestured. No one told her to leave. She walked out on her own as if that had always been her role, cleaning up what didn't belong. When the door closed behind her, she didn't cry. But inside there was a quiet crack, a sound no one heard but her. Back in the basement locker room, Amara returned the access badge Elliot had once handed her. She unpinned the blue cloth from her chest and slipped it into her pocket. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled the clip from her hair, as though her body was reacting to the loss of something precious, something she was never meant to hold on to. She remembered her first day behind him, remembered what it felt like to hear without sound, remembered the look in Elliot's eyes when he'd said, "I need you." And now it had all vanished suddenly and without warning, as if she'd never existed at all. She didn't blame him, but she couldn't forgive him either, because in that moment, he let silence become the door that locked her out. That evening, Amara came home earlier than usual. Zion was sitting on the floor, coloring a green fish with a crayon. He looked up when he saw her, eyes lighting up, and waved in sign, "Home early." Amara nodded, smiling. She sat down beside him, watching his small hands dance across the page, creating lines that weren't perfect, but pulsed with life. Zion never needed sound to communicate. He had never asked his mother to be anything but there. She signed into his palm, "Mom's staying home today." Zion tilted his head. Tired? She paused, then nodded softly. Zion climbed into her lap, his little arms wrapping around her neck. Neither of them said a word. Inside Amara, the sorrow didn't take shape as sound, but it was still there, like a song that wouldn't play, like a note scratched off the score. And she knew if Elliot had ever truly understood her language, he would have realized this. Sometimes silence is the loudest form of rejection, and also the exact moment when people fall away from one another, without ever needing to hear a door close. Elliot's penthouse sat atop the Carrington Tower, where every wall was made of glass and every sound was locked out by high-end acoustic technology. A space perfectly designed for someone who craved control. But tonight the silence wasn't a preference. It was punishment. Elliot sat in a corner of the living room, amber light casting long shadows across the walnut floor. In front of him, a glass of whiskey, its ice already melted. His laptop lay open but lifeless, the screen having gone dark long ago. He had never feared quiet, not until he could no longer hear anything at all. No knocks, no ticking clock, no soft drip from the water purifier. And when she used to walk in, she was the thread tying him to the outside world. Now that she was gone, that thread felt severed, and the loss, unbearable. Since the day Amara silently walked out of the boardroom, Elliot hadn't returned to the tech floor. He kept working, kept speaking, kept performing, but everything had become a monochrome performance without music. She was no longer behind him, no longer lightly tapping his sleeve to signal a warning, no longer nodding gently when he chose the right words. The space behind him seemed as if no one had ever stood there, but he hadn't forgotten. He remembered how Amara nodded instead of consoling, how she listened patiently, even when he didn't fully understand himself, how she never tried to enter his life, only stood quietly at the threshold, as if asking, "May I stay?" And he had let someone like that walk away. He had let silence become his silent approval for erasure. Near midnight, Elliot stood up and put on his coat. No call to his assistant, no location sharing, no calendar update. He drove through familiar streets, then turned down one he'd never taken before, where streetlights were dim, sidewalks cracked, and old houses lined up like temporary boxes for permanent lives. The address he'd seen listed Amara as living here on the city's outskirts, near the community center for deaf children. He parked, sitting still in the car for a few minutes. House number 9 had a faded blue door, thin curtains glowing behind a warm yellow light. No doorbell camera, no nameplate, just a chipped concrete step leading to a worn wooden door. He walked up and knocked softly. No answer. He raised his hand to knock again when the door creaked open from the inside. A little boy around 6 with curly hair and ink-stained fingers stood holding a green marker. Zion. The boy looked at him curious but not afraid. For a moment Elliot didn't know what to do, but before he could speak, Zion raised his hands and signed slowly, in ASL, "Hello, Mr. Can't Hear." Elliot froze, not from surprise but from how naturally the boy said it, like a nickname. No pity, no confusion. He slowly lifted his hands and signed back, "Hello, Zion." The boy smiled, genuine, simple. Amara appeared behind her son, hair loose, wearing a faded t-shirt and wide cotton pants. No makeup, no shield. Her eyes held only one thing, fatigue. "Why are you here?" she asked softly. No accusation, no expectation of an answer. Elliot raised his hand, then lowered it. He had no good reason, only an emptiness and the knowing that if he didn't come, it would grow until it consumed what little of him was left. Zion sat on a wooden chair near the door and resumed drawing. Amara leaned against the frame, arms crossed. Elliot looked her in the eyes, then signed, "I was wrong." She didn't nod, didn't deny it. She simply signed back slowly. The silence that day hurt more than a rejection. He nodded. "I was afraid. If I spoke up, I'd have to explain. And I wasn't ready to go against the board. I thought I'd fix it later. But you forgot. I'm not a project to be fixed later." Elliot lowered his head. No excuses. Amara turned and walked back inside, leaving the door open. A moment of unspoken invitation, and Elliot stepped in. The house was small but warm, Zion's drawings adorned the walls. An ASL alphabet chart was neatly taped to the fridge. Crayons without caps lay scattered on the floor. There was an old sofa, a second-hand bookshelf, and a kettle still warm. Elliot sat down across from the dining table. Amara poured him a cup of water, asked no further questions. Zion handed him a drawing. Two figures, one in a white shirt, one in a green dress, standing in front of a building, with a hand-drawn death sign above. Elliot smiled. Amara looked over, then asked quietly, "Why did you come tonight?" Elliot looked down at his hands. Then with his voice soft, eyes still locked on hers, he said, "Because I couldn't bear the silence when you were no longer in it." She didn't respond, but this time she didn't retreat either. And in that small house with cracks in the ceiling and the soft sound of a child drawing, a man who once believed he could control the world finally learned. Some sounds are never made, but when they're gone, you realize you were never truly alive without them. The kitchen light spilled a warm amber glow across the old ceramic tiles, as if the little room was being heated, not by electricity, but by light itself. The ceiling was lower than standard, but every object showed signs of care: spice jars arranged by height, a hand-stitched kitchen towel hanging beside the worn gas stove, and a chipped glass cup holding a bouquet of late-blooming wild daisies. Elliot sat at the pinewood dining table, its corners smoothed by time, his hands resting gently on his lap. His shadow stretched across the wooden floor, merging with a smaller one, Zion, who stood on a chair, leaning forward with ceremonial seriousness as he watched his mother sprinkle salt onto fried eggs. No one spoke, but the kitchen wasn't silent. It breathed, it lived. The gentle sizzle of butter in the pan, the clink of ceramic against porcelain, Zion waving his arms in rhythm with his mother's movements, a silent dance to a soundless song. Amara placed the hot plate on the table. Her hands, used to industrial cleaning agents and late-night mopping shifts, moved with surprising tenderness as she served her son a slice of toast. Zion climbed off the chair and sat across from Elliot. He studied the man's face, a face he'd only ever glimpsed as a silhouette in long, cold hallways. Then slowly, Zion raised his small hands and signed, "You eat too." Elliot watched the little hands dance in the air, no hesitation, no demand. He nodded and tried to mimic the movements. His fingers were stiff, unpracticed, but accurate. Zion beamed, gave a thumbs up. "Good job." Amara laughed the first time Elliot had heard her laugh in a space not defined by business. It didn't need to be loud or echo down marble walls. It only needed to exist in the right place, at the right time, and be real. During dinner, Elliot didn't speak much. He was busy learning not vocabulary, but how to communicate when sound was no longer the main medium. Zion taught him simple signs. "Mom, delicious, thank you." With each word, the boy would demonstrate, Elliot would repeat, and then both would glance at Amara like students waiting for a grade. When Elliot stumbled on fried egg, Zion giggled and smacked his forehead dramatically, like a tiny actor in a comedy play. Outside, night had deepened. Street lamps cast shadows of windblown branches across the curtain. But inside, hands still moved, eyes still met, and the little house glowed not with lamps, but with something unnamed and unmistakable. After dinner, Zion led Elliot to the ASL alphabet chart taped beside the fridge. The letters were hand-drawn in crayon, some crooked, some smudged, with a smiley face drawn beside the letter Z. Elliot bent down, his hand pausing at the letter E. He raised his hand and shaped the sign, then glanced over to Amara, who stood in the kitchen doorway, drying a plate with a towel. She nodded. "That's right." Zion tugged at Elliot's sleeve and pulled him to the living room floor. They began playing Guess the Sign. Zion would sign a word. Elliot would guess. If he got it wrong, he had to raise his hand in defeat and laugh. By the third round, Elliot made a mistake, and Zion rolled onto the floor in fits of laughter. The boy couldn't hear his own laughter, but Elliot could, and he realized it was the most beautiful sound he never knew he needed. Amara returned, her hair now tied back. She stood quietly at the entrance to the room, watching a man and a boy, one large and one small, learning a language never taught in textbooks, the language of patience and trust. It was bedtime. Zion was reminded by his mother. He hugged his pillow and ran into his room. Before closing the door, he turned back and signed, "Come again, okay?" Elliot signed back this time smoothly, without pause or correction. I promise. The room quieted after the door clicked shut. Elliot remained at the old wooden table. Amara poured him a glass of water, no ice. They didn't speak right away. There was a kind of silence between them that didn't need filling, the kind that felt earned. The kitchen light had dimmed now, casting soft glows across the table like reflections of breath. Elliot finally said, I used to think I was living well, in control, wise. He paused, staring at his hands. But I wasn't living. I was maintaining, chasing, shouting through a world too loud to hear me. Amara said nothing, slowly rotating the glass between her thumb and forefinger. Then my ears stopped working, Elliot whispered, and that's when I finally started hearing, truly hearing. Amara looked up. Elliot met her gaze. It's steady now. I hadn't lived, Amara. Not really. Not wholly. Not until the silence began. She looked at him for a long moment. No reply. None needed. Because in that brief and quiet space between two people who had spent their lives in the voids left by others, they understood something deeply. When hands learn to speak, the heart finally begins to listen. The central convention center gleamed under the early morning sun, its glass facade reflecting light like a statement of modernity and power. Inside, footsteps echoed against the gray stone floors, the sound of preparation, anticipation, and drama. This was the National Technology Conference where the world's leading corporations unveiled their visions for AI, data, and global security. And this morning, opening the main session, was Elliot Carrington, founder of Carrington Systems, who had vanished from the media for over a month following rumors about his health. No one knew what had truly happened. Even fewer knew he could no longer hear. Backstage, Elliot stood still in his charcoal suit, fingers gently gripping a folded cloth in his pocket. Beside him, Amara wore a dark outfit, hair neatly pinned, her gaze no longer avoiding others like it had on her first day at headquarters. Ahead of them lay a massive auditorium filled with hundreds of journalists, tech experts, shareholders, partners, and every eye was fixed on the spotlighted stage. You can still speak, Amara signed. I know, Elliot replied, but today, I want them to listen with their eyes like I once had to learn. She studied him for a beat, then nodded. When Elliot stepped onto the stage, the auditorium fell silent. He carried no notes, no lapel mic, just Amara walking a few steps behind. No introduction, no titles. Elliot stood under the white lights, his face slightly leaner than before. He scanned the crowd, then slowly raised his hands. ASL. Some blinked. A few glanced at the agenda as if they'd missed a line about interpretation. But before confusion could spread, Amara stepped forward and stood at his right. Her voice rang out slow and measured like a rhythm. I used to run a system that didn't require me to know what people were saying, only that they obeyed. Then one day I could no longer hear, and for the first time in my life, I began to listen. The room held its breath. Elliot continued signing, and Amara translated her voice, weaving through the silence like an invisible thread. I met someone who didn't need sound to be understood, just patience. She didn't hold a high position, but she was the only one who made me feel like I wasn't falling alone. Because of her, I realized technology shouldn't only optimize systems, it should preserve the human within them. No other sounds accompanied her words, no slideshow, no background music. She wasn't speaking like an interpreter. She was telling what he was signing as if he were singing, and she was the harmony. Elliot paused, breathed in, then signed again. Today, I'm not here to perform. I'm here to begin again in a different way. And the first person I want to invite up here is the one I didn't have the courage to hold on to when I should have. He turned to Amara. She didn't respond with signs. She simply placed a hand over her heart, one beat of thank you without words. The audience rose to their feet. Applause broke out, tentative at first, then stronger, fuller not because of the speech, but because of something more human. The courage to be silent and to let someone else fill the space. They weren't applauding for a keynote. They were applauding a man who had once stood above them, now choosing to kneel in truth. And the quiet woman beside him, the one who had helped him rise again, through a language no one had expected. An hour later, in a private press room behind the main hall, Elliot signed his first executive order since returning, the founding of the Department of Communication and Community Inclusion, reporting directly to the CEO or Director Amara Sloan, Senior Communication Advisor. When asked about the reason for her appointment, Elliot didn't let Amara speak for him. He stood tall, eyes forward, and spoke with a clear, steady voice slowly, word by word. I used to believe that listening was a soft skill, but when I lost my hearing, I realized it's the foundation of everything good we hope to build. I don't need Amara because I'm impaired. I need her because she's the only one who turned listening into action, not just reaction. Amara stood beside him, saying nothing. But when Elliot stepped down from the podium, he turned to her and signed one word. Thank you. And this time, everyone saw it. No one asked who she was anymore, because now they knew. She was the one who brought Elliot Carrington back. Not through power, but through hands that had learned to speak. The 8th floor atrium of Carrington Systems was once reserved for pitch meetings, tech conferences, and high-stakes board presentations. It was a place meant for resumes, credentials, and email addresses ending in at Carrington.size. Today, the person standing at the center of the stage was Amara Sloan, a former night janitor, a widow who once washed dishes in the mornings, a woman with no college degree, but more than enough capacity to listen. Behind her stood a simple sign, printed quietly in gray and white. Silent access, the room for wordless communication. Because every voice, whether spoken or signed, deserves to be heard. There were no elaborate speeches, no opening jingle, just sunlight streaming in through the tall glass windows, and over 100 guest employees, social advocates, nonprofit partners, all sitting in silence, waiting for something more real than branding. Amara stepped forward, holding no notes. Elliot stood a few steps behind her, no announcement, no authority on display. She lifted her face, raised her hands. ASL. And for the first time in company history, the interpreter was not behind the speaker. The interpreter was the speaker. Amara signed about the people the system had once forgotten. Workers who had lost their hearing in industrial accidents. Employees excluded from team meetings because they didn't fit the format. Children like her son Zion once asked to leave class because he couldn't keep up with the rhythm. She spoke with her hands, but everyone heard her. A professional voice interpreter spoke through the audio system, but eyes stayed fixed on Amara because the story wasn't in the sound. It was in the movement woven into the air, gesture by gesture, emotion by emotion. Zion sat in the front row wearing a white dress shirt, clutching a printed map of the new office layout. He leaned toward the boy beside him, also deaf, pointing out signs for elevator and quiet playroom. They giggled and added stickers to their paper. Just months ago, Zion had sat alone on the edge of the community schoolyard, the only one not moving when the bell rang. Today, he was one of the first official testers of a no-verbal interaction system developed right inside Carrington. Amara announced what would change: a new support center for deaf employees managed by deaf leadership, basic sign language training for all senior managers, a conference room with no microphones, no speakers, just light, paper, and hands, scholarships for employees' children with disabilities, including Zion. When she signed the final phrase, "Thank you for staying quiet long enough for me to speak." Everyone stood. No thunderous applause, just deep, unspoken respect. And somewhere in the crowd, a few people practiced, for the first time, a single letter in sign language. A for Amara, A for access, A for a soundless voice that still means everything. After the launch, Elliot walked onto the stage and stood beside her. They didn't speak, just exchanged a glance. Not between a CEO and an employee, but between two people who had once lived on the fringes of a system, and now together were building a new kind of door. Behind them, Zion waved to his mom, signing in big, clear letters, "I'm proud of you." And in that exact moment, all the lights in the room seemed to fade, because every heart present had already lit up. Rain fell all afternoon, tapping gently against the fogged window pane like a patient hand knocking on memory. In a small apartment at the end of an old row of houses, there was no vacuum running, no toys clattering. Zion was asleep, and Amara sat in a dimly lit room, the only light coming from a single desk lamp beside her, in a weathered silver tin box. The box had once held Marcus's watch, a small wrench, and his firefighter ID card. Now it held letters, handwritten ones, never sent. Amara lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of neatly folded pages, the paper yellowed with time, corners smudged by ink and tears. Every envelope bore one name, Marcus, her husband, the man who never came home after the fire on 12th Street when he ran into the flames to save 3 children still trapped inside. He never made it out. She pulled out one letter, her hand trembling as if touching it might somehow stir the past awake. Dear Marcus, it's been 7 years, but rainy nights still make me shiver like the one you left. They call you a hero, but I just remember you said you'd be home before dinner. I made your favorite. The rice went cold, but the tears stayed warm. Another shakier letter. Zion knows his dad was a firefighter. He's never heard the siren, but every time it wails outside, he runs to the window and waves. I don't know who he's waving at, but his eyes. They look just like yours. I never told him you left us. I told him you stayed where the light was needed most. Amara breathed in deeply, leaning back in her chair, letting the words soak into her chest like the soft rain on the windowsill. She didn't cry. Her eyes had learned how to hold tears just enough to let memories pass through without drowning her. A knock at the door, one beat, then stillness. Amara rose. On the porch stood Elliot, his long coat speckled with rain. He didn't say anything, just raised a hand in greeting, offering a small unforced smile. She opened the door. No questions, she understood, and he didn't need an invitation. In the living room, the warm light pooled around them like a hush. 2 people, once shaped by their own quiet corners, now sat beside each other among the letters that had never found a reader. Elliot sat on the floor, eyes drawn to the tin box. Amara didn't hide it. She opened it and placed one letter in the space between them. I used to think surviving was enough, that loss was the price of love. But lately someone's been coming into my home. Without noise, and yet somehow, bringing rhythm back to everything. I'm scared. But I don't want to be scared forever. I don't know what this is. So I'm writing to you first. Elliot sat still, no blinking, no words. Then slowly he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small sheet of leather-bound notepaper, crisp, neat, with handwriting that slanted slightly but stayed clean. He wrote, carefully, every letter shaped with care. Some things don't need to be spoken aloud. We only need to stay together. Amara looked at the words, then at him, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to fold the past away. Not because it had faded, but because someone was now sitting beside it, quiet enough to stay. Zion peeked out from the bedroom, rubbing his eyes. He saw Elliot. His face lit up. He patted over, tugged at Elliot's sleeve, then signed with his small hands. Will you stay for cake? Elliot nodded, and this time, no one translated. Amara rose and gently gathered the letters. But instead of putting them back into the tin, she stacked them neatly and placed them in the nightstand drawer. Not to hide them, but to keep them close. Like a part of herself she no longer felt ashamed to let someone see. The winding road into the eco-retreat curved through pine forests and endless meadows, like a ribbon of green silk stretched beneath the sky. No car horns, no phones, no alerts from any system. Here people called it the quiet zone, where the only sound was the wind. Zion ran ahead, his blue scarf trailing behind like a small cape. He didn't speak, didn't need to. He was listening to the world with his skin, his eyes, his heart. Amara and Elliot followed, walking slowly on a gravel path softened with moss. Leaves crunched gently beneath their shoes like a whispered language. Above, sunlight filtered through the trees, scattering patches of light that moved without sound. There's no Wi-Fi here, Amara said quietly, as if afraid to disturb the stillness. Elliot smiled, signing, and nothing here needs updating except the heart. She looked at him, smiled softly. The retreat had only 6 wooden cabins, scattered around a misty lake. They stayed in the furthest one, the one with a back porch facing the silent hills and slow valleys. Zion spent the whole afternoon drawing the lake, a deer in the trees, and a big tree shaped like a heart. He signed to Elliot, "You're the tree, Mom's the wind." Elliot didn't understand at first. He furrowed his brows. Zion smiled, pointing to the drawing. Trees don't leave. Wind can hold the tree. You don't need to say anything. Elliot nodded. Children often say the simplest things, and sometimes they understand love the clearest. At night, Amara brought out 2 thin blankets and spread them across the hill behind the cabin. The sky was full of stars, no city lights to drown them. Zion had already fallen asleep, wrapped in his lion and moon blanket. The adults sat close beside each other, surrounded by a silence the city had never allowed them. Elliot looked up at the stars, then turned to Amara. Her face tilted slightly toward the sky, starlight tracing soft edges across her cheekbones. She wore no makeup, no silk blouse, no spotlight. Just Amara, the woman who used to mop the floors at midnight, the one who once translated the world for him when sound disappeared. He inhaled slowly, then with his hands signed slow and hesitant. I don't know what love looks like, but I know I don't want to lose you. Amara turned to him, eyes slightly wide. Then she smiled. Not a surprised smile, not even touched, but a smile like someone who had been waiting a long time and wasn't in a rush anymore. She reached out and took his hand, not squeezing, just holding, then signed gently. Then stay. In silence. Elliot lowered his head. One deep breath escaped like a thank you. They didn't speak again. No promises, no labels, just 2 people, hand in hand, in a world that needed no sound, because everything that mattered had already been said by staying. The next morning before leaving the retreat, Zion wrote something in chalk on a stone beneath the heart-shaped tree. Silence isn't the same as not loving. He placed the stone there gently, and Elliot, a man who had once run an empire with his voice, laid a hand on his chest and bowed his head, like a child learning to listen with all the senses he had left. On Monday morning, Carrington Systems didn't start the day with an executive briefing or revenue update. Every internal screen from the mainframe monitors to the lobby's LED displays lit up with one single headline, A Letter to Those Who Cannot Speak by Amara Sloan, published by Tech Voice, Ideas in Humanity section. The office fell into a strange stillness. No one asked who uploaded the piece. No one questioned if the author held the proper title. They just read and stayed quiet, as if every word deserved its own silent space to echo. I used to be a cleaner, someone who worked when everyone else went home, someone who lived quietly not by choice, but because no one ever asked me to speak. I have no tech degree. I don't know how to write reports. I'm not good at presenting strategies, but I have lived in a world without words, and I know exactly how it feels to be invisible even while standing right there. My son is a child who cannot hear, cannot speak the way people expect. But Zion has never been silent. His hands are always moving, just like his heart keeps beating, quietly and steadily. We don't need applause. We need space to exist, to be heard in our own way. And if you're reading this from a place where no one hears your voice, I just want you to know I was you, and I'm here right now. Amara Sloan. Within hours, the piece went beyond Carrington's firewalls. Tech Voice's homepage, particularly the Humanity and Innovation section, usually reserved for Ivy League essays, posted the letter, unedited, uncut, exactly as it was. It reached over 8 million reads in just 24 hours. Among them were thousands of people rejected from job interviews because of communication style. Parents who had once received reports stating their children had language problems, and even those who had never spoken a word. But after reading the letter, sent their first ever email. Days later, in a short feature film produced by the Human Voice Foundation, broadcast nationwide and across global YouTube platforms, the camera showed a 6-year-old boy sitting in a bright classroom, eyes focused like a beam of light. The boy was Zion. He didn't speak in the video. He simply stood before the camera, raised his hands, and signed clearly and proudly, "My hands know how to speak." Then he looked past the lens, where Amara stood, her hand over her chest, eyes fixed on him. Zion signed again. "And my mom was the first to teach me. I was never truly silent." The final frame of the video showed their hands, mother and son clasped together. No music, no voiceover, Just one moment of absolute sacred silence that no one dared to interrupt. Later, during a special interview with Amara at the new communication center, someone asked, "What do you think made you successful?" Amara didn't speak. She smiled, lifted her hands, and signed a single word: listen. Strangely, the entire studio, the director, the crew, the editors, understood her perfectly. No one mentioned subtitles. No one asked her to repeat. They just looked at each other and nodded. You're watching Soul Stories exclusive to our channel. If you're still with us, drop a comment we read and cherish them all. Subscribe to support more heartfelt, original stories. Thanks for being part of the Soul Stories family. One spring morning, Carrington Systems quietly welcomed its CEO back to the top floor after nearly 8 months away from public meetings. There were no reporters, no live stream, just an internal gathering where the man once forced into silence now chose to step into a familiar space, wearing a small device behind his right ear. Elliot had recovered most of his hearing after months of treatment and therapy, but the surprise wasn't that he could hear again. It was that he chose to keep using silent mode, a custom setting in his hearing device that allowed him to mute the outside world whenever he wished. At the office, he activated it often. When I lost my hearing, Elliot said, his gaze slowly sweeping the room, that's when I finally started listening. No one interrupted. No one asked him to explain, because they all understood. Sometimes the loudest sound is the silence that lets someone finally speak the truth. Amara no longer led the Silent Access program. She had passed it on to 2 deaf team members, former trainees from the community center. As for her, she still came to the office every week, but not on a schedule, not to clean, not even to consult. She came to have coffee with Elliot in a quiet little room full of plants, which he affectionately called the room for listening with your eyes. One afternoon, they sat in that room again. The glass walls framed the city like a quiet painting. Elliot had switched off his hearing. Amara knew he always gave a small tap and a nod before doing so. No words, just glances, smiles, fingers brushing fingers. Elliot reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small black box. No ribbon, no sparkling gem, just a simple silver ring with a message etched inside in ASL, stay. He didn't kneel. He didn't propose with grand gestures. He simply held her hand and signed, I don't need a wedding. I don't need a white dress. I just want to wake up every morning and find you still here. Amara didn't answer right away. She reached up to his face, gently removed the hearing device and placed it into his hand, then said softly, barely a whisper, what I love is not whether you can hear me or not. It's that your heart knows when to stop and listen. Elliot squeezed her hand, nodded, and no more words were needed. The next day they went public with their relationship. No press release, no formal announcement, just a single photo posted to the company's internal portal, taken in the garden behind the community center where Zion studied. Amara sat on a bench in a gray sweater, hands wrapped around a coffee mug. Elliot sat beside her, his arm resting gently around her shoulder. In front of them stood Zion, arms raised, fingers signing boldly with a smile bright as morning. This is my family. The caption below read simply, not every love story is loud. Some just need a heart quiet enough to listen. Morning sunlight spilled sideways through the sheer white curtains, casting soft streaks across the smooth wooden floor. The small kitchen was warm with the scent of ginger, honey, and toasted bread. Amara sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a pale gray ceramic mug. Steam rose gently, like warm breath meeting a quiet morning. There was no rush, no makeup, no tightly packed schedule like the years before. Today was just a morning, ordinary. Zion sat on the wool rug by the window holding a little cat named Echo, the name Elliot had chosen, after Zion first signed. It doesn't have to make a sound to be loved. Echo nestled into the boy's lap, its white and gray face peaceful, eyes half closed, tail twitching softly as if it, too, was listening through touch. Beside him, Elliot sat on the floor, back against the wall, laptop open on his knees. He was teaching Zion a basic coding game, but through sign language. On the screen, colored blocks appeared. green for if, blue for then, yellow for result. Each time the code ran correctly, Zion beamed with joy. He signed, "I want to build a game using only my hands." Elliot smiled and nodded. No need to speak. He understood, completely. No one said a word. There were no lines, no background music, no drama. Only the sound of the wind drifting through the open window, brushing past small fingers in motion, through the soft silver in Elliot's hair, across the gentle curve of peace on Amara's lips. She looked at the two of them. A man who once believed power meant silence, and a child who had once been called mute. Now they were crafting their own language, one that needed no validation. Amara set down her tea. She rose soundlessly. She stepped behind them, leaned in, and placed a hand gently on their shoulders. Zion looked up, his hands still resting on the keyboard. He signed, "Mom, I did it. The computer listens to my hands." Elliot turned to Amara. He didn't sign. He didn't write. His eyes said it all. "Thank you for not giving up before I knew how to hear you." Amara bowed her head ever so slightly. The sun climbed higher, and its light spilled over the scene. Three people, imperfect, unusual, but whole in a way no one else could truly understand. Just another day, but far from ordinary.